So in this presentation, we're going to be taking the LR women's soccer data and really breaking it down and looking for areas in which infiltration needs to take place in order to ensure the athlete is maintaining maximum performance and training appropriately based on the data collected. So you can see in athlete 1, we're looking at the effect size estimate as well as the acute to chronic workload ratio. And one thing I would note here in the effect size estimate is the times in which the ratio is right at the cusp of 2 or it overcomes 2 and is these workload ranges that can be as much as 4 or 6 in the effect size ratio. And the data suggests, and the research suggests, that any time the effect size estimate is over 2, that the training is often too strenuous, which is going to require that athlete to have a day off following that training for proper recovery and adaptation to training. So I would caution the coach of this realm and suggest that in this case, the athlete is going to need a day off after that high training load to prevent injury and ensure proper recovery. In reference to the acute to chronic workload ratio, the coach is doing a great job in training for the majority of the time, keeping it within the upper and lower limits. I would caution him that around this time where it drops below 0.8, that the athlete is actually detraining based on what research suggests and what the data is illustrating. And it might be good to put this athlete through a strenuous workout to help them increase that drive of adaptation to training. In athlete 2, we're looking at the SPC for average RPE as well as for fatigue, and then we'll have this illustration of the training volume below. As you can see, the lower limit of these graphs is the only thing that is indicative, and the upper limit is not even identifiable on these graphs. And what this tells me is that athlete 2 is often not experiencing training loads that is going to inflict proper training adaptation. So because they're not experiencing fatigue, hardly at all, that is abnormally low, as well as the rate of perceived exertion of training sessions, I would encourage the coach that, hey, this athlete probably needs to be pushed a little more based on their data in order to really enhance their ability to perform at their best caliber at some time. Similarly, in athlete 2, we look at the effect size estimate, which is the same as athlete 1. You see how everything remains below the threshold other than these little spikes in data. And you can see over here specifically on the training monotony and strain, where I want to place most of my focus, how the training monotony and strain is significantly above the threshold of monotony, indicating that this athlete is either in need of a great training stress that's going to really inflict that training adaptation, or they're going to need days off. And based on what we saw in the first graphs of their RPE and fatigue, this athlete is most likely not being pushed to the element that they can really inflict training adaptation. So I would say that the data suggests that the monotony is high, causing their strain to be high in this training, and to inflict proper development of this athlete, I would encourage that the coach create some variability. So throw in some higher training loads coupled by more tactical days of recovery in order to help see greater changes in this athlete. In athlete 3, we're looking at the SPC for stress, and you can see that this is staying below the cusp of the lower limit, which is indicative, but you're also seeing too that over here, the effect size estimate for total sprint distance is occasionally above the threshold of 2. This could be because maybe they're not pushed to a great limit. So you could say the data suggests that during these particular weeks where the effect size estimate is above 2, that it would be an area of concern which could potentially need to be followed by a day off, or maybe greater implementations of those higher training loads to inflict a little more stress on the athlete, which is going to help training monotony scores decrease, making it more impactful for the athlete. We look at athlete 4, and as you can see here, based on the questionnaire data for sleep duration, sleep quality, and stress that we're experiencing, specifically for sleep duration and quality, that the sleep duration and sleep quality is significantly below the lower limit. Now, one confounding variable that I found quite confusing was how the stress limitation, how they were also under the cusp for stress, but I would often be like, look, coach, I just want to bring to your attention the data suggests that this athlete is not sleeping long or well. And I would just make sure that coach is aware of this to where they can potentially discuss with the athlete what potentially might be causing them to not sleep, and explain to them also just the implications that can cause in recovering well and how it can increase your risk in injury, and just looking out for the overall interest of the athlete. So with athlete 5, we're looking at their acute to chronic workload ratio, their training volume, and the monotony and strain. Similarly to an athlete we've already discussed, the monotony and strain is greatly above the monotony threshold. And you can see too that these relatively low training volumes over the course of the week is pretty indicative. And you can see too that the acute to chronic ratio, oftentimes we're really staggering around or below this cusp of detraining. So based on this, I would say the data suggests that this athlete is not experiencing drastic influences on performance. So they're not being pushed to an area to where they can see those training adaptations. So I would encourage implementing a large training strain, whether that's getting them into a game or implementing them more in the practice rotations to help them see those differences in training volumes to reduce the training monotony we're seeing here and help drive adaptation. In athlete 6, I saw the effect size estimate just talking about their total sprint distance focused on the SPC for soreness. As you can see, their soreness is greatly below the cusp of lower limit, and while that is okay, delayed onset muscle soreness is something that is prevalent whenever you're experiencing training adaptation. So due to the lower level of this, and also due to the lower level of the effect size estimates, while it's always uncertain that they remain below 2, I would encourage that they're mindful of the need for rest when the effect size ratio is above 2, but also note that maybe implementing higher training stresses followed by days off with more variability in the training could help drive this athlete to greater advancements in performance. So we're looking specifically something very similar when it comes to the effect size average for sprint distance, as well as the acute to chronic workload ratio for total sprint distance based on their stress. So you can see here that, again, I would caution the coach. I would say the data suggests in numerous places on the graph that the athlete is on or below that 0.8 cusp. So whenever they're on the threshold, I would caution the coach I would say, hey coach, the data suggests the athlete is on the lower cusp that research suggests is the lowest they can be without actually detraining in their training. So I would often encourage them to create those spikes in training to really create variability in the training load, which could also allow their stress to go up, and rather than the stress remaining below the lower limit, creating more stress within that middle ground that's often going to be more normal and provoke adaptations in training. In athlete 8, we're looking at the training monotony and strain based on the total distance in practice, and you can see that, again, it is very much above the monotony threshold. And when I look at the questionnaire data focused on really the RPE here, you can see it's below the lower limit. So this data suggests to me that the training volumes are remaining relatively low and consistent in how low they are, which can often cause the athlete to not experience the training adaptations that they need. So to reduce the training monotony and overall reduce the strain, considering that they go hand in hand, I would encourage the coach. I would say the data suggests that the athlete is not showing much exertion in practices, and this training monotony and strain is very high. So in order to help your athlete advance greater, make sure you implement that variability and maybe push them harder on some days, followed by days of more tactical recovery and rest. So based on athlete 9, you can see here these few points of the AC ratio for the total training load of training sessions that we are getting to this same 0.8 cusp of detraining. I would caution the athlete caution the coach. I would suggest what the data shows and to implement those greater training stresses as we've already talked about. And similarly for the SPC for sleep duration, you can see here that the SPE score is indicating the athlete is greatly below the lower limit, which I would make known to the coach, where the data suggests this athlete's not sleeping long. So this could be something where the coach pulls the athlete aside to really get an idea of what they have going on. Same thing we've talked about with other athletes. With athlete 10, training monotony and strain is going to need some implications. So I would say the data suggests that when there's little variation in the training, thus greater training monotony, it often increases the training strain. So when we see that, I would often encourage the coach to have those fluctuations in training volume. That's going to help better drive the athlete to adaptation. And similarly, we see in the effect size training load and the acute to chronic ratio, the same things we've discussed in other slides. Similarly, with athlete 11, we can see that he's often above a threshold of 2, so I would then encourage the coach. I would say the data suggests that the player is being stressed beyond normal limitations, so they're going to need a day off in order to recover and adapt appropriately. In athlete 12, you can see the training monotony and strain is greatly above the threshold, so as we've indicated before, we're going to need, the data suggests that they have a great training strain due to the training monotony, and we're going to have to put some sort of implication in to ensure that this athlete is recovering and adapting well to training. Same sort of concept on this slide. You can see that we remain in the cusp of the AC ratio for session load versus these times where we're on the lower threshold and might just be some areas of concern to ensure that we put in the appropriate training stresses and variability for these athletes to adapt as it's intended. With the effect size for session load as well as the acute to chronic ratio, as the threshold is above 2, I would encourage the coach. I'd say the data suggests this athlete is being strained greatly above what is normal. So I would often interject and inform the coach that the athlete is going to need that day off for rest and recovery. The biggest thing on athlete 15 is the continued focus on the acute to chronic workload ratio. And as you can see, we have this drop in this general area where it's below 8. So as I've mentioned before, I would say the research suggests whenever an athlete is training below the acute to chronic workload ratio of 0.8, that they're actually detraining. So I would encourage the coach then that a hard training stress, such as getting into a game or getting into the playing rotation in practice, could really help this athlete grow and adapt to training. We can see too that we have these great jumps in session load, and I compare this to the questionnaire data with sleep because we can see we have these cusps above 2 where the athlete is going to need that additional recovery, but a great advocate for recovery is sleep. So because sleep is so pertinent in recovery, when you see that the athlete is greatly below the lower limit of sleep duration, I would often warn the coach and I would say, listen, the data suggests this athlete's not sleeping, which means that they're even struggling more than normal to recover. So this could be an issue to where they might need to pull the athlete aside and figure out why they're not sleeping or what's going on in their personal life. In athlete 19, we can see session RPE scales based on training monotony and strain. You can see when the training monotony and strain spikes over the threshold, it can be areas of concern. As compared to the session RPEs, we see these great spikes, which are above the upper limit. So at this point in time, I would encourage the athlete, like, hey, this athlete, according to the data, is experiencing great training strain. So followed by these times to where it's spiked over the upper limit, I would often try to understand what's causing the athlete to be experiencing such strain during sessions, as well as implementing a day off or implementing a lower tactile type training in these certain days in order to ensure the athlete is recovering appropriately. Athlete 22, we're looking at a lot of things here. Effect size estimates and acute to chronic workload ratio we've discussed. As we're above the 1.5 range, I would encourage the coach to reduce training loads because this often is indicative of overtraining. So I would say the data suggests your athlete is overtraining, and we want to ensure that they're staying healthy and adapting as well as possible. Similarly with sleep duration and fatigue, when that sleep duration and fatigue when fatigue is above the lower limit, above the upper limit, and fatigue is below, that's often something that we want to bring to the coach and make sure that he's aware of. And that's all I have for you, and thank y'all for listening.